Hi everyone, my name is Samuel Fuller. I'm a second year medical student at George Washington University, and I was mentored in this project by Dr. Robert Turner, also from George Washington University. And today I'll be talking to you about sports participation and the brain health of former high-level athletes. A little bit of background before we get into our actual study. So when we looked at the research, we saw that there were many studies that examined the pathophysiology and the clinical management of concussions. However, only a few of these studies actually examined the psychosocial factors associated with concussions in the former high-level male athletes, and we're defining that as the NCAA Division I sports as well as the NFL. And then, so our study sought to examine the question of how do former high-level athletes view their time in sports and the effects it's had on their health behavior and their brain health. For our study, our participants were recruited nationally using a variety of different methods. Once they were identified, we then screened them to determine their eligibility, with the inclusion criteria being adult male age 30 or above, and having been a former NFL, former Division I football player, or former Division I non-contact athlete. The design of the actual study was a mixed methods approach using qualitative focus group answers paired with de-identified quantitative health survey questionnaire data. We then had 6 different focus groups, so 2 NFL, 2 Division I football, and 2 non-contact athletes via a web call from May to June 2020. And then we transcribed those focus groups and we were able to analyze those for our data analysis. In Table 1, you can see the demographic information for each of our focus groups. So for the former NFL group, we had 10 participants, former Division I football, 9, and former Division I non-contact, we had 8. We included their average age and their different playing years, since we know that the concussion protocol was obviously very different from 1976 until 2014. And then we also included their race or ethnicity, and we know that since this was such a small sample size that these proportions may not be indicative of how they actually are in the sports. In Table 2, you can see the sport breakdown by the non-contact athlete group. And then in Table 3, we can see the concussion data that we gathered from our quantitative study. We can see that former NFL players had the highest number of concussions at about 10.8, so close to 11, followed by former Division I football players who had about 7.2 concussions on average. And then former non-contact athletes, as would be expected, had the lowest number of concussions, just under 2. We also included the median, which was the same breakdown across the groups. And then we also found, we looked at worry about brain health on a scale from 1 to 8. And what we found was that former NFL and former Division I football players both had about the same worry about brain health, even though former Division I football players played for less amount of time on average and had less concussions on average. In comparison, the former Division I non-contact athletes, since they had less concussions, also had less worry about brain health. But again, what was interesting was that the worry about brain health for former NFL and former Division I football players was the same, even though that NFL players played for longer and had more concussions on average. One of the main findings that came out of the focus group was that brain health was much more a topic of concern among former NFL players and former Division I football players in comparison to Division I non-contact athletes. One really striking quote was from a former NFL player who said, "I'd be lying to you if I didn't tell you I'm probably more scared of CTE than I am of cancer." And this is important because this participant actually already had cancer and ended his career. Another one came from a former Division I football player who was essentially having short-term memory loss, but this is concerning because he was only 31 years old, which would be far younger than what we would expect to see this typical age-related decline in brain health. Lastly, we had a former Division I non-contact athlete who was a swimmer, and basically he said, "I've never had a concussion or been worried about having a concussion," again just highlighting that they don't have as much of a worry about brain health. Here is my works cited section if anyone wants to explore further. And lastly, thank you to the conference for allowing me to present this information to you guys. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to contact me at my email sfuller9@gwu.edu.